Welcome everyone to this, the fourth of the Wheeler Centre's Ideas for Melbourne week, and tonight, as you all know, we're looking at environment and sustainability. I'm Adam Morton, I'm the Environment Editor with The Age, and I'll be sort of directing traffic tonight for the expertise on my left to give you their views. Immediately to my left is Kelly O'Shanassy, the Chief Executive Officer of Environment Victoria, one of the state's leading conservation groups. And to her left is Kirsten Larsen, the Policy Research Manager, I hope I've got that right, at VALE, the Victorian Eco Innovation Lab at the University of Melbourne. And we're going to have a chat for a little while and then we'll throw open to the floor for questions in the second half. Just to set the scene, very basically, Victoria is, or is the question was, I suppose, the Garden State, and Melbourne is often rated the world's most livable city. It's also growing quite rapidly. Under one scenario, the Bureau of Statistics has projected it could overtake Sydney as Australia's most populous city before 2040. And we hear talk of more than 6 million people by mid-century. The Victorian population is increasingly focused here, where once 60% of the state's population lived in the regions, now more than 70%, or about 70%, is in Melbourne. And this is obviously placing pressure, and will increasingly place pressure on our resources. Urban sprawl is an obvious issue, and the state government has signalled it may open up the state's green wedges for development to accommodate the growing population. More broadly, Victoria is acknowledged to be the state with the country's most degraded and stressed landscape. And on top of this, there's obviously the projected threat of climate change. All easy problems to resolve, of course. We might start by getting our guests to introduce themselves and their organisation and to talk a little bit about how their view on how we should measure and how we rate Melbourne's environmental health. Kelly, perhaps you could start.
Thank you, and it's exciting to be here tonight. As Adam said, Environment Victoria is a community organisation. Our name sounds like we should be a government organisation, but we had our name back in 1993, and then the Victorian government decided to call EPA Victoria and Sustainability Victoria and Parks Victoria after our name Environment Victoria. So what I say tonight is from a community perspective, not a government perspective. I always like to open with that. But at our organisation, we kind of love the environment, really. I mean, many people here also do, for its own right, because it is in fact quite beautiful, and it deserves to be protected because of that. But also, and very importantly, it actually provides all life, wealth and health on the planet. It underpins everything we do. It provides the air we breathe and the water we drink and stuff so that we can grow food that we eat, fertiliser and a whole range of other things. It is the reason why we all exist, and we take that for granted a lot, and particularly if we live in a city. We don't think about cities often as environments, but actually they are. They are ecosystems of their own, and they're built environments, and Melbourne is a beautiful environment. Most Victorians love Victoria's environment, love Melbourne's environment, which is fantastic, and we've just done some polling on this, and well over half of Victorians think that our environment is in good shape. The science doesn't back that up. The science is very clear that it's actually in quite poor shape and declining. So I suppose most Victorians think it's great, but they also think it's declining. So they understand there's quite large risks to that. And because the environment is in trouble through climate change, through renewable resources being used too quickly, so we are using resources each year much faster than we can replace them. And we use resources about twice as much, really, as we can actually use them. So we use much more than can be produced every year in a renewable sense. And of course, non-renewable resources we're using very quickly as well. And this idea of peak oil and phosphorus and other things is real, and a real problem. So because the environment is in trouble, and increasingly so are we, because we depend on it for every single thing. And the days of us being able to take for granted water availability and fertiliser availability and oil availability and land that will produce food for us will be numbered, and then we'll start arguing about that. and competing for that. And so we have to think about how we can become much, much smarter in both in our urban life and across all of Victoria to protect it, because it's not in good health. And the key indicators of that are things that we see every day. So Adam talked about being the most cleared state in Australia. 75% of our rivers in poor condition and getting poorer, and most of you know the Murray-Darling Basin process is happening at the moment, and in Victoria we have the worst river in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is the Goulburn River, which is not a Melbourne river, of course. And of course we've got the most polluting power plant in the developed world producing our energy for Melbourne. So a sustainable city is one that will be here in 100 years' time with people in it that are thriving. And we all want to be a thriving, healthy community, and we have got to change to get there.
Kirsten.
Okay, hi, I'm Kirsten. I thought just to give you a bit of context about where I come from around the environment and sustainability and the systems basically that support us and our cities. I started out working in the State Government Department of Sustainability and Environment about probably 8 years ago, and was involved in sustainability policy, things like that. And then I was involved in setting up the Victorian Eco-Innovation Lab, and the ethos around that was basically that we're incremental change to the systems that we have is simply not going to get us to where we need to be in terms of what we knew then 5 years ago about the speed of climate change and resource decline, etc., and that we needed to be exploring different ways to get people thinking outside the box and thinking outside of the way that we currently live and what our cities currently look like. So we really work a lot with future scenarios and visualisations as a way to engage people in what very different sustainable cities might look like and feel like, and would you want to be doing something like this? One of the important things about Vale and the approach that we take is that it's not just about the environment. We understand the environment as being, the world in which we live. And then it's the social organisation and economic organisation that's part of that, our cultures, that actually really shape our environment and how we live with it. So that talking about, for us, the environment as a separate outside thing doesn't make as much sense as talking about the whole system of culture and society and how we live in urban areas, what kind of jobs we do, how far we travel, what sort of resources are we using to do that. So my work at Vale, I started working on food systems particularly and trying to understand where the discussion about food was in sustainability, because that time 4 or 5 years ago was pretty much completely absent. And really through that work, exploring what do we know about the food system, became really aware of just how dire the situation is in our environment, and the interplay between how we live in cities and what is happening in rural and regional landscapes. So the health of our rivers and the health of soils, loss of biodiversity, these things are really innately connected with agricultural systems and our economy, which then feeds into, what we eat, how we live, what we live in, what we use. So these things are all really, connected, obviously. And I came back in and worked for a couple of years in climate change policy in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and now also working in social enterprise. And that's one of the areas which I think is really interesting and hopeful in Melbourne, is the number of people who are really looking at different kind of business models and different kind of economic structures that might actually help us to deal with some of these problems. So I guess the key thing about the environment and, what kind of state is it in and what kind of indicators, I think absolutely critical to be looking at the natural environment as we know it, the state of the rivers and the soils, but we also need to be looking at the human environment and the cultural environment. What's our relationship like? What sort of biodiversity do we have in the cities? What are we eating? Where's it coming from? What are the impacts? To actually be having this kind of indicators about our environment is that people actually understand and have choices and actually enjoy living in our environment and regenerating and increasing the diversity of how we live. So we're in pretty serious trouble in terms of climate and peak oil, and particularly the financial implications of peak oil globally. So these things are going to cause significant changes to the way that everything works over the next 10 years or so. So it's going to be some real challenges in terms of how we organise our economy. And the big thing is to really understand we do need to understand how those changes are going to happen so that we can make the significant changes to lifestyle, etc., that we need.
There's a whole lot in there.
It's a good little rant. Sorry, I have a tendency to rant, be warned.
There's a whole lot there, and I want to come back to the issue of consumption in a moment, but I want to start on a very specific issue, a very Melbourne issue, seeing this as ideas for Melbourne. Melbourne's green wedges, the parks and farmland and open space that sometimes described as the city's green lungs and were created by the Liberal Hamer government in the 70s. Now, there's some suggestion the government has raised the possibility of rezoning some of this land as residential or for other purposes. Kelly, does that matter, and if so, why? Is it green wedges in a city that's growing so quickly an outdated idea?
Well, someone very, very smart, I'm not actually sure who it was, way back in the 1800s had the idea of green wedges because they protected Melbourne's water supply and didn't allow development on there, and now we don't have to treat our water like most cities around the world do, which has an economic benefit. We don't have to pay for that treatment. So it matters a lot because the green wedges provide the lungs of Melbourne, commonly called, you may have just said that, they supply our water. They actually supply our agriculture and wineries, very important, don't forget them. They have our farms, they have an airport on them, so they're not just about nature, but they're areas where I suppose nature and humans intersect quite a lot. So they are really important because they're a fundamental part of our ecology as a city, if you think about the city as an ecosystem. But there's another reason why they're really important, because if you look at the map of the green wedges, everyone would go and visit them in any given year in Melbourne on a weekend or on a summer's evening, and they're within 1 or 2 hours drive from the city centre, and so they're actually where our soul exists, and they're about health as a community and freedom in a way, because we can drive an hour and get into the Yarra Ranges. But the thing I would note that's really hard is that not all green wedges are really pretty or beautiful, because they do include these pieces of infrastructure, and some of them aren't very nice at all, like the Western grasslands. And I know this is video, I probably shouldn't say that, I'm going to get in trouble. But a lot of people look at them and go, it's brown grass, let's develop on it. But they forget that there's an ecosystem there, that there's only 1% of that ecosystem left on the globe, and that has a function for our society. So they are important to keep, and they're under really significant threat because they're such a political issue under almost every political party. But they've been around for over a century, and we need to keep them.
What impact would it have if they were to go, or some of them were to go, Kirsten?
I think one of the interesting things about green wedges is that they have been going fairly steadily for a long time. So yes, certainly they were put in 100 years ago, but the city's been rapidly galloping across them ever since. And I think in some ways when dealing with the green wedges, that does lead to a bit of a sense of inevitability, and certainly that plays out around land use planning and how people interact at the green wedge interface, that there is an expectation, look, it's just a matter of time till we're going to be developed and we can make lots of money. Some of the things that are really significant about the green wedges are obviously everything that Kelly said, absolutely agree with. The agriculture that is done there, cities generally are settled in areas that are highly productive, that they actually have good soils and you can produce food there pretty easily. As agriculture gets displaced and goes further out, sometimes that does go to areas where the soils are not as naturally productive, which means you need to use more fertiliser to produce that food. Fertiliser generally is produced from fossil fuels or phosphate, which is mined. So you end up with a more intensive agriculture as you go out. There are also possibilities as we do experience more expensive energy and the impacts of that. There are also possibilities of producing food in green wedges where you can use the waste from cities. So all of the organic waste and food waste that we have, wastewater, recycled water. One of the big challenges obviously in food production is having ready availability of water and regular supply. So you have that possibility around cities when you're in close proximity, which is not so easily available in other places. So there, as well as the obvious factor of not having to move the food as far to get it to the people who are trying to eat it. And particularly for fresh perishable produce, fruit and vegetables, milk, eggs, things like that, that has an impact on refrigeration, on length of time in storage, on your whole supply chain infrastructure. So there are really solid reasons why it's important to maintain and in fact probably increase the amount of food production in the green wedges. It's also very important to understand that there are good reasons why the farmers and the landowners in the green wedges are interested in selling up and getting out. It's pretty hard to farm in those areas with urban populations across the road that don't like chemical sprays and things like that. So there's some real challenges, there's some significant policy challenges about how to do it. But I absolutely agree that the opportunities of what the potential is for having those places as places, yes, where we can go and potentially have wild spaces and protect biodiversity and have space and fresh air and water and things like that. They also present opportunities for interaction, closer interaction with farming communities and agriculture and where our food actually comes from. So that's some of the opportunities that we have in the peri-urban areas that we really don't take advantage of at the moment.
Kirsten, you've worked, I think you mentioned it before, with CSIRO on food supply scenarios for the future, and there's an expectation that if, as expected, we move away from fossil fuels, increasingly food will be competing with energy for land and our resources generally. What were the implications of your work? What did those scenarios find, and what do they tell us about what we should be doing now?
So what we looked at with those scenarios is we took some assumptions around what the median population projection was at the time. It was about doubling the population by 2050, is that right? Something like that. We basically took those assumptions and then we looked at some different scenarios for greenhouse gas reduction based on what is scientifically required, 450 parts per million. Some of them went further into saying we actually need to reduce emissions much faster than that. How would we actually physically do it? And I've just realised that no one has any background. I should just explain that the modelling that we did, the CSIRO, which is Australia's scientific agency, basically has a model that they've been building for about 10 or 15 years, which basically is a physical account of the country. So it has the amount of land that we have, it links into hydrological models about what's happening with the water, how much energy it goes in to build a car or to make fertiliser, so it's linking the whole physical economy basically. And what we did in this project was to say if you want to provide a nutritious diet to the population of Australia or of Victoria, there's a certain, how much fruit and vegetables, how much milk, how much eggs, things like that, then what kind of resources are you going to need to do that? And then how do you sort of put your greenhouse gas emissions reductions, attempt to reduce imported oil, attempt to reduce imported phosphorus, putting more water back into the Murray-Darling Basin, things like that.
And so what were the expectations around import and export of food?
So they differ in the different scenarios. Yeah. We didn't want to make an assumption that one way was better than the other. So there is a scenario that just says, look, we would continue with a market-led approach, so we'll produce most of what we can sell most on the export markets, lots of dairy. We would reduce fruit and vegetable production further because we can just buy it, things like that. Then we had a scenario that was based on, for some reason, at the national level, the government decides it would be a good idea to be able to produce the food requirements for the population here first and then export surplus. So we allowed land reallocation to do that. And then the third scenario said, can we do it at a Victorian level, produce the amount that we need for the Victorian population and move land to do that. So this was an initial project to see if we could make the model do this. But basically what we found is there's some serious constraints to actually being able to complete any of those three scenarios. In all of the scenarios, even as we ended up with no water in the Victorian sections of the Murray-Darling Basin. We had climate change projections in there by 2050, 2060 in most of the scenarios, and that was taking 40%, reducing the amount taken out for agriculture by 40% in one scenario, 60% in another. And you still see those levels dropping below zero, which obviously you can't do. The two of the scenarios enabled us to get a significant drop in emissions out to 2030, but then it starts coming up again. There was a large allowance for carbon sequestration and increased land movement into tree planting, basically. So then you see that that's also coming out of agricultural land and food production. So basically what it shows is, look, there's a real challenge to achieve what we might view as sustainability. We can't actually have everything the way that we've got it now in terms of assumptions around population growth and energy growth per person and water use per person. The only scenario that actually, I'm almost finished, the only scenario that actually enabled us to even things out was the one where we actually allowed for a slowing of economic growth and a reduction in the amount of energy use per person, so that actually the amount of energy being used overall throughout the economy for each person was declining, rather than the average assumption, which is in all government calculations, of basically 2% increase per year.
So I want to let Kelly come in here, but before we do, so basically I'm going to put this in simplistic journalistic language, but that basically suggests that what we're told... Can't have your cake and eat it too. Basically, that suggests what we're told about the cost of acting is not realistic.
Say that again.
What we're told at times by government about the cost of acting locally to make the adjustment we need to make to face the challenges we're facing from a climate point of view and from a local environmental point of view, the cost is greater than sometimes suggested. Is that what you're saying?
I would go further than to say the cost is greater than sometimes suggested. I would say it's physically impossible to continue along the path that we're being told that we can continue, with an increasing amount of consumption per person, increasing population. It simply doesn't add up. There's a certain amount of resources in the bath, so to speak. There's a certain amount of land, a certain amount of water, and I should just add, we had really optimistic assumptions going into these scenarios about water efficiency, fertiliser efficiency and energy efficiency across the whole economy. So probably the results would be worse than we accounted for.
So one last question on that. What are the implications then from a policy point of view? You've worked in government. If you're giving advice out of that, what do you say?
Pull your finger out. Always listen to. Yeah. What my advice has been is that we actually need to take this seriously, that we actually need to develop these kinds of modelling capacities that can take all of these issues into account, and we need to seriously consider the fact that technological innovation and magic bullet technological solutions can't be relied on to pull us out of this. When you actually sit and look at how things all add up, there is going to be a need to draw resources out of some areas and to make some strategic choices about how we use them. So we do need to make strategic choices about food security, energy security. Australia's oil production, our domestic oil production, peaked in the year 2000. So that means that every year we've been producing less oil in Australia and importing more, about 5% more per year. So what that means is that as global oil production has also peaked, the cost of that goes up and up and up. At some point, we need to really address, okay, is that viable? Is that feasible forever, to just assume that we're going to be able to do that? If we think that we can replace it with gas, then we have the consequences of fracking technologies and gas mining, which impacts on groundwater, which impacts on food production. So the point is, everything's connected, and unless you're really willing to take a long, hard look at that and say some things have to stop, or some things actually can't all be done at the same time, then the policy that you're making is piecemeal and basically shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. Sorry, be a bit dramatic, but that's...
Kelly, what are the ramifications of that for someone in your job who's... part of what polite. You do is trying to bring about community change and lobbying the government for change.
It's really interesting having a job like mine, because how do you go home every night and leave the work at work? And vodka can help, but it's not that good for you, so you shouldn't do very often. But actually I'm wildly optimistic about I'm not I absolutely agree that change is inevitable. We should love it. We should embrace it and go for it because it is going to happen. So let's drive it instead of it letting driving us. But I think that there's growth potential in some economies, clearly. I mean, let's get the clean energy economy going. That's a huge solution that we are floundering on. And there's jobs, there's economic growth, it can power our planet still, and we've got the resources to do it. Now, the transition's going to be messy, it's going to be hard, it requires a lot of assistance, particularly to communities who can't afford the cost that energy will be, but renewable energy is getting cheaper and coal is getting more expensive. One sun rising, one sun setting. Where are you going to invest your money? So there's real opportunity, and I'm excited by that, and I don't want the paradigm to be let's do less and let's give up. It's about let's be smarter. So I'm really excited by that approach. And also the other thing though, the negative side, I was telling Adam before, is I'm kind of given up a little bit on governments, to be honest, to create the changes that we need. And our organisation was very strong in lobbying for the 20% emissions reduction target for Victoria, replacing Hazelwood with clean energy. It took a long time to get the ALP state government to agree to that. A lot of people were involved. We put a lot into that. Got it, lost it. Because the government changed.
Well, not technically yet.
Well, we lost Hazelwood, so we went to the federal government, and we think we're going to get that back now, or at least some big coal plant in Australia shut down, so that's good. Now, we haven't technically lost the 20%, but it's going to be difficult. So I'm a bit sick of politics, and if we need to make big changes, I'm not sure the politicians are in a space to get us there yet, and I'm actually quite interested. Well, obviously, community driving that and speaking up for it and having a huge wave and mobilisation around our democratic right to a safe environment, I think will grow. But also, I'm really interested in the role businesses can play, because if you look at how our world moves, it's community and businesses that are huge drivers, and government are almost the police. They set the policies, but they do it really late. So I'm really interested in how we empower the progressive businesses in Melbourne and in Victoria to change our city and drive that change in the direction we want it to go rather than the direction it's going to take us.
One aspect of that, obviously, the central aspect perhaps, is renewable energy. And I'm interested in the work that's happening we're talking particularly about Melbourne here, so the city of Sydney is embraced, or at least started to embrace, where it's doing this interesting work under this bloke called Alan Jones, and it's not that Alan Jones, but a British Alan Jones, who they're saying that by 2030 they're going to move to a much more decentralised energy supply, so introducing trigeneration. I'm running a lot of the CBD on trigeneration, where cooling and heat and power are combined, and it's run within the CBD. At the moment, Melbourne obviously gets the overwhelming majority of its energy from burning brown coal in the Latrobe Valley. What can be done at a city level to promote cleaner energy supply? The UK is leading this area both in energy supply and energy efficiency. So the whole entire town of Birmingham has been retrofitted in their housing stock to be energy efficient and reduce energy use by about 75%. They've also got a goal to have zero carbon neighbourhoods by 2016, I think the date is. That's what we can do. So we retrofit about 2% of our housing stock a year, and that housing stock that's been retrofitted or renovated is a 2-star or less, and it's only the new buildings need to be 6-star, but actually it's much more economic to go to 7 and 8 and even beyond that. We've done some work around that. So we need to, if we think about our city as an ecosystem, then we have to function, and part of that function is energy, and having solar on roofs and having solar on roofs that are much bigger, that can generate capacity for others. So I live opposite a Yarra Council. It's really hard to get solar on my roof because it's a bizarre roof, even though perfectly north-facing. But the council across the road have got a huge catchment area. And so why aren't we thinking about how we can live as an ecosystem a bit more carefully? So we can certainly generate our own energy. We can be super efficient in how we use it.
and particularly in our housing stock, uses 17.5% or so, generates 17.5% of our emissions. Do you know what we can also do? Because Melburnians are incredibly passionate. They love a rally. Every time we have the walking and swarming in Melbourne, 50,000 people. Sydney, 2,000 people. So I'm just saying, nothing to do with the organisers, just Melburnians love to stand up. So we should stand up for clean energy in the Latrobe Valley, because that is what's feeding our city at the moment.
Kirsten, unless you've got something you want to add, that might be a good time to go to the floor. But
I might just add something.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I agree that the vodka solution to this stuff doesn't work. I've been there. And I'm also extremely optimistic. And what makes me optimistic is it's the communities, and particularly the small businesses, innovation, design-led stuff that I've become exposed to over the last 5 years. You know, Melbourne really is an incredible city for some of the things that are going on. One of the founder of worldchanging.com, a guy called Alex Steffen, who's a bright green sort of fellow. He travels around the world looking at all of the amazing things that are going on. He spent 6 weeks in Melbourne over the summer, basically because he'd heard that there was a lot going on here. And when he was asked what is it, you know, when you're in a seminar or something like this, you know, and everyone says, you know, tell us something about our city that makes us feel good about ourselves, kind of thing. And he sort of thought for a minute and he said, you know, I'm not going to say trams or parks or whatever. He said, in Melbourne, I've seen something that I've never seen anywhere else in the world, which is that so many people working on these kinds of projects actually help each other and share information and genuinely want each other to succeed, so that there's actually a really strong, thriving network of really creative people working on just about everything that you can imagine, whether it's food systems, energy, water, green roofs, biodiversity, getting trees into the place, migrants, immigrants, refugees. There's so much going on here where people are just finding different niches and thinking very differently about what the solutions might be. And so that, I agree absolutely. I've given up on government too. I think it'll be great when they come along behind, but they're certainly not going to be leading any charge anytime soon. The politics isn't there to allow it, but that doesn't mean that you give up and go home. It means that you get out there and get excited and find something that really, you know, turns you on and get involved in it.
And we should be clear that when we say government, because we work together actually, but it's not the bureaucracy. It's the political will. There's that what are we giving up? But we have to change that as well. You know, that's what our job, people in this room and many others, has to be over the next few years. Otherwise, we are going to lose.
Sorry, Adam, may I just make one more comment?
You don't owe me any apologies.
I'll keep this one really short. I think one of the things, it sounds like I'm about to do a doom and gloomer thing again, but I'm really not. I just think that there's an importance about facing reality. And there's physical reality, and there's also the fact that what's happening globally at the moment around the implications of peak oil and the increasing costs of energy is flowing through into the financial system, and an economic structure that is based on growth, which is based on an increasing amount of energy going into that economy every day. That's basically what economic growth has been for 50 to 100 years or more. So in a situation where you can no longer put more energy per day into the economy, even if you're doing renewable energy, it's just not going to replace like that. We really are dealing with fundamental shifts to economic structure, and we're seeing all across Europe and the States, these are having significant implications for the amount of capital that's available, the amount of money that's available for governments or private corporations to invest in renewable energy technologies, infrastructure, etc. So we're not actually in the position that we would have been 15 to 20 years ago to transition our infrastructure. We're not going to be able to do that as easily because the money's not there. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be focusing really hard on what we can do and keep trying to do it, but it's just that it's going to be really challenging. So it's a multiple, eggs in different baskets kind of approach. We are looking at very, very significant structural change. It's
going several directions there, but it seems like a good idea. And some of them are related to Melbourne and some of them are much broader. But obviously all these things are tied together. But it's a good time to throw open the floor, I think. So if you could raise your hand if you've got a question and introduce yourself, and if you're directing it to someone in particular, perhaps say that. And we'll start down here.
My name's Jan Lansdowne. I'm just a resident, but I'm very interested in the work of Beyond Zero Emissions, and I'm interested to know if you used any of their data in the modelling that you were doing with CSIRO.
The only thing that we actually went through and used of their data was the energy efficiency assumptions, so that they used about 30% or something was reasonable based on a German economy. So we didn't actually go through and update all of the renewable energy technologies that might be available, but we have got, because it was a pilot program to see whether we could use the model like this, so we have got further research funding, so we'll be working on this model to really refine all of these assumptions over the next 3 years. So we will have a long hard look at what energy technologies and assumptions are going into it. And we are also talking to the people who are working on the BZE land use plan to see if there are some opportunities for crossover as well.
Down the back.
Frank Fisher. I'm currently being treated for a brain tumour in a hospital that, or should I say in a cancer centre that is situated on top of a car park. The implications of that, because I can see there aren't many indications of much implications, go back, let's say, to the 1990s when the EPA did a whacking great study that went for about 5 years and showed that about half of, no, I put it the other way around, about twice as many people died by car through diseases caused by car as died by crash. So roughly 300 died by crash, 300 died by diseases caused by car, and many of them are cancers. So that aside, it points to a bigger issue which is not being dealt with here at all, and it drives me nuts that it's not. For about 35 years I've taught graduate students in environmental science. I'm a professor of sustainability, and my concern is that we don't deal with all the perverse incentives that exist in society to take us down these anti-environmental paths that we presume to be concerned about in this room. Things like cheaper by the dozen, of course, and they absolutely saturate our way of life. They saturate our government, they saturate the way we think, the way we do things, and we're not even aware of them. And the consequence of that is when we come up with that sort of thing, we then place people in a situation of cognitive dissonance, so they feel that they're presented with something that they can't deal with. We don't get an opportunity to explain, let alone unpick those perverse incentives.
Frank, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm going to get to a question.
There's no question. There's just a statement. Yeah. Let's deal with them. Let's deal with those perverse incentives. We do not do it currently.
Well, I was just saying that my partner went to his friend's house once, and the guy had a coffee bean dryer, coffee bean grinder and a coffee maker, and he had his little takeaway coffee cups, and he leaves them all on all the time so he can get his coffee whenever he wants. And Rich came home and told me, and I went, oh my God, they're the people that we're trying to convince around this issue of consumption. And then I thought, at no point in time am I aware a coffee expert designed a coffee bean dryer, a coffee bean grinder and a coffee bean maker to be sustainable and to reduce, to turn on automatically, to tap into the heat coming off the fridge to power it, to do a whole range of other things. And if we can change the design of stuff that we use every day and make the people who design it responsible for it at the end of its life, so this is a product stewardship model, then we can change how that product impacts on the world. We also have to change behaviour, and I think which Frank's talking to. But there are huge subsidies and perverse. I mean, there's a lot about consumption. There's a lot of waste in products because the person who makes it doesn't have to think, or design it doesn't have to think about it at the end of its life. TVs and computers will now have to be recycled in Australia by the companies who make them, and they will now have to make computers that are not toxic, that can be recycled. And so I think a real opportunity for Melbourne to look at those perversities is to become more of a design. If we're a smart city and we're hanging on to manufacturing like there's no tomorrow, and it's going to be hard for us with our labour prices to hang on to that. But if we're a smart city, can't we look at Germany and copy some of the stuff they're doing around design? And something I think, Adam, you might have written when you were overseas recently about the Germans being outcompeted on solar panels by China, so they design the machines that make the solar panels and export that.
And move up the chain.
Yeah, and that's what we have to do, I think, to get to some of those perversities, is to make the people in the design phase responsible for its end phase, and I think we'll see a big change. And that's not to let all of us off the hook about how we use products, but they can be a lot smarter.
I think I agree, and I think there's also a question about the assumptions, not your assumptions, but I think this is what Frank's getting to, about that I should have my coffee available at all times at my beck and call, and that is absolutely okay, because actually, you know, from a Melbourne to a global perspective, there are some real problems with some of these kinds of assumptions. We can get a long way with design. We can certainly do a lot better in terms of resource efficiency, absolutely. But some of those questions, the question about cheaper by the dozen, the assumption that getting more for less and paying less for it is the way that we make decisions in our lives, is really the core of a lot of our problems. It's part of the reason why I find working in food so empowering and enlivening, because people, the whole slow food movement has come out of saying, okay, well, we actually want to be connected with taste and quality and biodiversity and who produced this and what kind of life did they have. And that doesn't mean that it needs to be astronomically expensive. It means asking questions and taking some responsibility for it. And I know that it's still considered to be that this is, you know, niche, you know, way out there that doesn't work for everybody. Actually, there's a hell of a lot of activity all over the world about real food, food sovereignty, food security, how this actually works for, you know, farmers as well as for disadvantaged communities. It shouldn't be too expensive to get high quality fruit and vegetables to everybody in Victoria. That shouldn't really be a problem, and it shouldn't be a competition between farmers being constantly pushed down. The reason that that is happening is because there's so many people in the middle creaming off their bit of the supply chain. So the kind of design that we're looking at, the kind of design challenges that we have are actually systems design, and we do need to think about the assumptions that sit behind them, and the assumptions of, you know, we're the lucky country and we can have everything we want, and you know, there's plenty for everyone, and therefore we shouldn't let anyone else in, so we can keep living the life that we've got because it's quite nice. I personally don't ascribe to those assumptions.
I guess one of the real questions that flows from what Frank was saying, though, is we don't even hear this idea. And I'm working in the media, I can hardly point the bone at anybody else. But where does the leadership come from on this? Because at the moment, the message we are getting is that we can address whatever problems we're facing and have our cake and eat it too.
Well, it seems to me like, as we've both said, the leadership is actually coming from communities. It's small, but there are transition movements. It's small, but people really starting to say, well, how do we take responsibility for this and live? We can live good lives in a city like this, absolutely, and use a lot less. I don't see leadership coming from government. I think there's a big potential for leadership from small business providing, you know, good quality food and energy services and water services and things like that. That's not counter to what is in the interests of small businesses. it does start to get more difficult as you're moving up, a scale into trying to do national and international supply chains.
I think that the leadership can also start in conversations like this, because I'm sure someone's probably going to ask about population and consumption issues, hopefully. And we get asked about it all the time as an environment group, and it's a huge issue. And consumption actually is a bigger issue because it's twice as large. So we're consuming more and more and more, and it's growing much more than the population is growing. So it's an issue that needs to be debated. So if we don't know what the problem is, or we don't talk about the problem, how are we ever going to lead on something? So we have to just start talking about the problem, even if you don't know the answers. And there is this notion, Paul Gilding's new book, or not that new anymore, talks about this idea of a great disruption to the economy, because he's trying to get all politicians and business leaders thinking about this. So he talks about it through an economic lens. But nonetheless, there is a great disruption, and there's something in front of us that's unthinkable and something in front of us that's unimaginable. So we better start imagining it, because it's going to be unthinkable otherwise. And these sorts of debates around the problem, seriously, what the problem is, not let's fluff it over, that we won't have enough water, that how can you adapt in climate change to days that will be over 50 degrees on their hottest days? I don't know how you adapt to that. I don't know how you grow crops in that. I know I can stand inside under an air conditioner, but how does your river survive that?
I suspect your power is not going to be going.
And if I have my own power supply. So it's a really, I think the leadership comes from having the discussion first about the problem and being serious about that problem. The trick is not to dwell on it, though, because we'll all want to be very depressed and drink a lot of vodka afterwards. We need to also talk about and imagine what that future looks like so we can move towards it.
Okay, another question.
Yeah, I'm actually a sustainability management professor as well, and I agree with a lot of what you said. See a lot of changes in the business community that are moving, partly because of economic realities, partly for whatever reason they're moving. I see changes in the community, but I also happen to be a marketing professor. And what you're talking about in terms of changing consumption habits is a very difficult marketing question. If you look at any of the marketing literature on consumer behavior, changing people's habits based on long-term benefits is like the hardest marketing issue ever. Okay, so my question is, have you seen any models where there's demonstrable change in consumption habits based on some sort of either government, business, or community action?
Yes, I was about to say that we have one here in Melbourne. On the only thing that I'm aware of where a resource has actually reduced in its total use, not being more efficient but just overall use reduced, is water in Melbourne. So it's wonderful only having a limited supply of something. You're certainly going to know how to save it. Where even water use has gone back up, but not quite as much as was thought, and not much over the target 155, which no longer exists, which is very depressing. So there are examples. I mean, I agree with you, and when Kirsten was speaking earlier, I'm going, yeah, but how do you get people to do it? Like, I agree with it, but and I do think it's a journey, and I think the smarter stuff, whilst talking about the problem and saying, well, here's what we can do at least, much, much smarter. And I'm not just talking about changing light bulbs, redesign and things like that. But yeah, water is an example where we are using less because of a mix of regulation and a lot of marketing, but most of all because we saw the dams going down, I would probably argue.
I think probably two things, absolutely agree. The classic examples people give are around smoking and drink driving. It's possible to do things with big, heavily funded media campaigns. But more than that, I would say it's about the power of pull. So it's not about telling people, stop doing that. I think at the moment it's about saying, I'm doing this, and the social structures that start to change around that. And we do see that, in food movements, in things that become, even just a discussion about how do we feel about flying internationally for a holiday, we are seeing some of those kinds of shifts. And then the third part is simply necessity. So we all know that cost of living factors change people's lives and lifestyles. I've heard recently that the only sector of US construction that's actually growing or healthy at the moment is the retrofit of houses to get extended families back into them, because the financial pressures are such that sustaining the kind of housing that they were living in before simply isn't viable. We see the same thing in the global financial crisis. People suddenly start getting interested in different cuts of meat. So there certainly some of the, this is why I say it's, with a scary economic thing, but it is part of how some of these changes happen. And there has been certainly literature that I've seen about how the bounce back even in Australia wasn't, there were some habits that kind of changed about people saying, all right, I don't need to spend so much. Certainly within Melbourne, maybe it's just my experience, I haven't done any research, but I think that there are more people working part-time voluntarily than there were, 10 years ago. So there's certainly cultural shifts around some of these things about, all right, do I actually want to keep earning more and more money, or would I rather have more time? So certainly these discussions are live in the community, but they tend to come from, hang on a second, so-and-so who I know and trust is doing that and seem to be having a good experience with it. And that's one of the things that is really interesting about Melbourne, is that there is a really interesting community of people exploring all of these kinds of things.
I'd like a comment on the idea of the effective planning, and it seems to me that as the government changes, we get a new Minister for Planning, and I think we have to get away from a Minister for Planning. I think we should have a committee and therefore have a strategic plan that we stick to and not make ad hoc decisions for all sorts of political reasons. I'm just wondering if that's a remotely possible thing in the future.
Sounds like a great idea. Love to see which government brings it in.
I was just trying to think, where else that would be excellent. Taking the politics out of things is important to do. I don't even think politicians would kind of like that, to be honest. Maybe not that particular example, but we'll have to ask Matthew Guy what he thinks. He's got a bit of a beating since he's been in, so maybe he would appreciate it. I was just trying to think where else this taking it out has worked. But, actually, planning obviously is complicated, but it's also be quite rule-based and structured, as you're saying, have a plan and stick to it. And one of the saddest days in my time in my job was when Melbourne 2030 folded, because it had a plan, and some of it was really, really smart, and I was very sad about that. It wasn't this government that did that, of course. So I think that we should be, as much as possible, we just need a longer term time frame. We know that how politics runs is difficult in 4 to 3 year terms. It's very difficult. So as much as we can take out of that, I think that anything long term should be taken out of that as much as it can. Is
the Federal Climate Change Commission that's been set up to advise about targets and gateways over time in reducing emissions, obviously it can be disallowable by the Parliament, but it's given a lot more weight than the average advisory body. Is that the sort of model we're talking about? It's obviously a very different scenario.
But even the Water Commission nationally, I used to work in the water industry a while back, and I was trying to get a discussion about use of recycled water into our drinking supplies. Some people might not like that here, but it actually is proven in many parts of the world. And we actually achieved putting that in this Melbourne plan that I did, even though it had a political overlay, because I think the Water Commission were actually out there saying, well, here's the evidence to that. And so the politicians were then saying, okay, well, we don't have to do it, we can start the conversation about it. So they're probably good examples, and perhaps we need to think more and more. They talk about that with the green wedges too, rather than having individual councils manage it, having some sort of overarching process. And well, let's just protect some of them, full stop anyway.
Someone's got to be first. Might well be Victoria.
Yeah, we lead quite a lot on stuff. Let's go for that one.
Hi, my name's Kez, public servant, interested local. I was interested to hear you say that the type of change that's going to be required is likely only going to be achievable outside of government. I agree. the main issue I see with that is that large corporate interests with lots of money are by and large resistant to the types of change you're talking about. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts, ideas or examples about how, if we empower communities to make decisions for the community's benefit, that we deal with corporate interests, moneyed interests that are resistant to that type of change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's been lots of examples where community campaigning have changed a corporate outcome quite quickly. It's usually very pointed though, so to try and get Mattel to stop using rainforest and Borneo trees from Borneo to package Barbie and Ken products. They succeeded in that. Then you try and solve palm oil and orangutans. I was recently over in Borneo, so a bit obsessed by protecting it. And that's a very slow process and very difficult process. But there are enormous examples where communities can create great change. And also there's some really big multinational corporations and actually some smaller, very smart corporations whose home is in Melbourne, that are creating big change. And Fujitsu is a good example. Xerox is an example a long time ago where they moved from selling the product to renting you the product and updating it. So Fujitsu have done that now with their IT services. And they're doing more, we've been told, more work in greening their customers and reducing the emissions from their customers than they are in their product sales. So it's a combination, and in fact you can't leave government out of it, because government create the opportunities, as we hear from government all the time. They do create the policies and the incentives. And in Germany, you know, there's fantastic solar and renewable energy in a really not very sunny place because of the type of structure that government put in place. So there's the wheel of change requires community, business and government to work together, but I don't think that the huge driving force is going to be from government, but it's like the structural integrity in a way.
So many thoughts. I think it's something like, I heard a term recently around global swarming, and I think what I think in response to that question is I agree with everything Kelly said, and it's about focusing. It's not that we don't need government, and it's not that things wouldn't be accelerated greatly if government was doing things. It's just that if we can actually focus attention on putting enough pressure on key things, like we saw this around export of animal products, you can get policy change really quick if you can get a sort of explosion of energy. And I think that that's where you can potentially mess with the government, because quite often it is government-corporate nexus that is the problem. And if you can apply enough pressure in a democratic system to actually breaking some of those relationships, then perhaps you get somewhere. It's just about not coming at government for everything, because that's not working. So in food, for example, I tend to say we do need to keep working on government around GM and legislation on genetically modified crops. That's something that we can't handle at a community or grassroots bottom-up level. Similarly around fracking, and so things that are potentially damaging groundwater supplies for however long. We really should be focusing our efforts on government intervention in those areas and then moving to other areas. And it's a similar thing. So if corporations, you know, will move, they have to sell stuff to people. So they've got a two-pronged approach, really. You know, they need people to buy their stuff and to like them. So there is a possibility of consumers just turning away and then change behaviour. And their other approach is to be subsidised, supported, policy incentives, etc., by government. So it is really considering those as two separate things and looking at, you know, tackling them with different approaches.
Very conscious of the time. Do we have time for one last question? Because I know there's a few hands left, and we probably haven't got through as many as we could have.
Thank you. My name's John. I was reading the recent quarterly essay by the former senior economic advisor to the former Prime Minister at the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, and he concluded that all the things you're saying should be done, but at the end of the day we still have to rely on technology to get us through. How do you respond to that?
Who wants to go first?
Well, as I said, I actually did Melbourne's water planning before this job, and I might just add that my plan didn't include a pipeline to Northern Victoria or a desalination plant, but leave the country for 6 months and look what happens. Sorry, what was the question?
Technology.
Technology, yes, sorry. So I was just going off on this. And what we used to try and... When I started, they all said, right, we just need a new dam, we need new technology. They thought that the behaviour change was done, that we weren't going to save any more water. And lo and behold, there's 100 billion litres of water savings in Melbourne that actually the coalition government have also supported. And that's not technology, that's obviously a showerhead, but the real saving is in the behaviour. So the technology, I just find people who say that can't hang their name or a plaque on, a behaviour change. I just find politicians, it's safe. If I can build a dam rather than make 3.5 million people save water, or hope they will, then it's much easier. And from a political viewpoint, I can understand that, but we have to... It's not going to be the only solution. And our work with sustainable living, working with communities, shows that if you just change the showerhead, you will get a saving. But if you work with that community to look at their behaviours and empower on that, they're saving 4 times the amount of energy and water than other programs that are just retrofit or technology programs alone. So there's a huge saving there, but we have to have faith, I suppose, in communities to do it.
Kirsten, I hosted a session here last year with Andrew Charlton, the author of that essay, and I imagine in one level he'd agree with you, which is the sums don't add up. And that's basically his thesis. But he comes from a quite a different perspective from you, and he said, well, there's no evidence to suggest that what we currently have available to us will provide, or that community action, even if it were so motivated, wouldn't be anything like enough. So why is that wrong?
Look, I think that I agree. Obviously, scale of the challenge has been pretty clear about that. We've had technologies that potentially could have been very useful over a long time, but without those assumptions around consumption and an inability to keep increasing energy, it doesn't work. I think some of the critical things about the technology silver bullet approach are that it does tend to take anywhere between 10 and 25 years to bring a technology from something that is an idea in a lab to something that's commercialisable and out there. Some of the exceptions to this are around IT. I think a lot of the promise to me is in the technologies that enable collaborative open source development of solutions. Those kinds of technologies are really interesting. But to think that there's going to be, magical energy technologies, I think is just a farce. There's been talk about nuclear fission for 20 years or something, that this is going to work, and along it comes, and it might. But the technologies that we're seeing to be developed to deal with, say, the energy crisis around fracking, coal sands extraction, mining, things like that, they're not necessarily the technologies that are fixing the problem. And technology has always only been it's a tool, and it's the society that chooses how to use the technology, really. So I'd say the same thing about genetic modification of crops. Even if we were able to come up with technologies that can help with things, the way that we apply them and the way that we use them is likely to perpetuate some of the problems that we have unless we change some social assumptions. So, I don't believe in silver bullet technologies that are sitting there waiting. I think there's no easy answer. We have to do all of these things that we're talking about. If a silver bullet technology comes along, then awesome. We're still in a much better position because we've spent 10 or 15 years trying to do absolutely everything else. But to sit back and say, let's not kind of worry too much about that because I'm sure something's just across the horizon. That said, Paul Hawken, the author of Blessed Unrest, was in Melbourne a couple of months ago, who also wrote Ecology of Commerce or something. He's really leading environmentalist from the States. And, he had a funny little look on his face at one point in a lecture and said, I've got investments in some things that you're not going to believe that are coming across the horizon. in sort of 5 to 10 years. So I was very sceptical, as you can imagine, but he's a man whose work I greatly, greatly admire. So if he's seeing some things coming across the horizon that look positive, then good. Don't wait for them, though.
Exactly.
Well, on that tentatively positive note, one of the few, we have to rule a line on the evening. We've taken up more time of your night than we were supposed to. Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you to Kelly and Kirsten for giving up their time and their thoughts.